You wake up believing you have a choice. You choose what to wear, what to eat, how to begin the day. You believe these decisions rise from somewhere inside you. Yet there's a faint, almost imperceptible sensation that something has already leaned in your direction before you arrive. A light pressure in the chest, a familiar mental pull that guides you where you always go. You call it routine. You call it taste. You call it personality. You don't call it conditioning. Not yet. Because calling it that would mean admitting that many of your decisions don't originate where you think they do. And that idea is deeply unsettling. It touches a quiet place you've learned not to visit. You move along invisible tracks. They don't announce themselves. They don't resist. They are smooth, almost comforting. They were laid down so early that you don't remember choosing them. They teach you what is safe to want, what is dangerous to feel, what is normal to accept. You don't question them because they sound like your own inner voice. When you think, this isn't for me, it often isn't you speaking. It's something absorbed, repeated, reinforced. Something that shaped you while you believed you were simply becoming yourself. There's a particular kind of fatigue that doesn't come from the body. It comes from repetition without awareness. From reacting the same way. From fearing the same outcomes. From chasing the same rewards. You label it a phase. Burnout. Stress, but it returns wearing different clothes. New situations, the same inner movements, and somewhere beneath it all, you sense that you are living variations of the same day. The same hesitation, the same restrained impulse, the same quiet surrender disguised as logic. You may never have stopped to notice how much the environment teaches you to decide. Subtle signals, small approvals, silent disapproval. These refine behavior the way hands tune an instrument. You learn when to speak, when to stay quiet, when to want more, when to settle. You learn without lessons, without warnings. You learn by belonging, by being corrected, by being compared. And as you learn, something in you adjusts, tightens, or recedes until it becomes what you call me. There is an unease that appears when certain choices feel too automatic. You reach for your phone without thinking. You respond in familiar tones before understanding why. Fear arrives before evaluation. Excitement before clarity. No one is actively controlling you. It's subtler than that. The control has already been installed, layer by layer, and now it runs quietly on its own. Efficient. Invisible. If this sense of moving on autopilot feels familiar, pause with it. Don't dismiss it. This recognition matters. It keeps this space alive for those who feel that something doesn't quite fit, but can't yet name what's missing. Even noticing the feeling is already a small deviation from the track. You might sense a restless curiosity now, as if something is close to being revealed, but still blurred. This sensation is important. It means a layer has shifted, not into clarity, but into awareness. Like eyes adjusting in low light. Shapes begin to emerge where there was only shadow. And you realize that the shadow has always been there. Conditioning rarely looks like a prison. It looks like common sense, like logic, like comfort. It tells you that things are the way they are. That change is risky. That questioning too much creates problems. It offers explanations ready-made, so you don't have to ask deeper questions. And you accept them because acceptance costs less energy. But this economy has a price. It shows up as a vague frustration. A sense of living below something unnamed. You were not programmed in one moment. You were adjusted gradually. A comment, a reaction, a reward, a punishment, each repetition strengthening a pathway. Each pathway making the next choice more predictable. Predictability is efficient for systems, but it slowly suffocates those who begin to feel there is more to them than repetition. As you listen, part of you may want to disagree. To insist that you think independently, that this is exaggerated. This resistance is not a problem. It's a signal, a familiar loop protecting familiar ground. Observe it. Don't argue with it. Just notice, because noticing by itself is already outside autopilot. From early on, you learned which responses brought safety. A well-timed smile, a careful silence, an extra effort not to disappoint. These were rewarded subtly. Approval, belonging, peace, and your system recorded them as success. Not a strategy, but as identity. Over time, You repeated them not because you chose to, but because they worked. What works for survival does not always work for living. Conditioning doesn't know the difference. It seeks predictability. It avoids pain. It leads you down known paths, even when something inside you asks for expansion. That request is often silenced before it forms. Not by choice, but by learning. You begin to confuse adaptation with who you are. You call yourself reserved when perhaps you learn not to take space. Practical when perhaps you learn not to dream. Realistic when perhaps you learn not to expect. These beliefs solidify slowly, repeated until they feel unquestionable. There was no single moment when curiosity faded, just small surrenders. Not asking to avoid discomfort, accepting shallow answers because you were tired. Gradually, the world became more predictable and narrower. Conditioning doesn't need to control you. It only needs you to keep responding the same way, to believe your reactions are fixed. Natural, this belief holds everything together. You may have felt brief moments of estrangement, watching yourself agree when you didn't want to, staying silent when something wanted to speak. These are small fractures. They close quickly, but they leave a trace, a sense that there is more behind the automatic response. You were taught to distract yourself from these gaps, to fill discomfort with noise, to stay busy, to keep moving. And so you adapt. You fit in. And in doing so, you drift away from something essential. This distance doesn't feel like pain. It feels like emptiness that still functions. You keep going, producing, interacting, but something is missing. And no amount of stimulation fills it, because it comes from disconnection, not lack. Stay with this awareness. Don't rush to resolve it. Conditioning unravels slowly when you allow the question to remain open. When you don't close it too quickly, there's a quiet part of you that has always noticed patterns. It doesn't shout. It whispers. And in a world trained for noise, it's easy to ignore. But it's this part that begins to move when conditioning is seen. You may feel a gentle tension now. Not fear. Resistance. Familiar systems prefer stability. So they label this reflection useless. Excessive. These are defenses. Functional ones. Observe them too. Nothing needs to collapse. This is not destruction. It is disassembly. And disassembly takes patience. Conditioning has not disappeared, but is no longer invisible. And that alone changes everything. There is space now. And in that space, something real begins to breathe. That space doesn't announce itself. It doesn't feel like freedom at first. It feels like uncertainty, like standing between movements without knowing which one comes next. The system inside you prefers momentum. It prefers immediate reactions. So when there is a pause, even a small one, it tries to fill it with explanations, with justifications, with old stories. Notice that impulse, the urge to conclude, to label, to move on, and see if you can remain just a moment longer before doing so. In this pause, you may begin to sense how deeply conditioning lives in the body. A tightening before you speak, a shallow breath before you disagree, a subtle contraction when attention turns toward you. These reactions arrive before words, before thoughts. They are memories held in muscle and breath. Not memories you can recall, but memories that recall you. They remind the body what once felt safe, what once felt dangerous. And the body responds instantly, trying to protect you. This is why it often feels like there was no time to choose. The reaction was already there. But time does exist. It's just very small, and it expands as awareness deepens. When you begin to feel the body reacting without immediately obeying it, something new becomes possible. Not control, but relationship. You begin to relate differently to your own impulses. You start to see that the goal isn't to eliminate conditioning. That would be impossible. Conditioning is how you learn to survive, to belong, to navigate the world. The problem isn't that it exists. The problem is when it becomes rigid, when it becomes the only voice. Flexibility is what changes everything. And flexibility doesn't come from force. It comes from observation. A quieter curiosity may begin to replace the urgency for answers. Not the curiosity that demands conclusions, but the kind that simply wants to see. You find yourself wondering what happens inside you, just before you speak, just before you agree, just before you withdraw. This question shifts attention from what you do to how it forms. And in that shift, subtleties emerge. You may notice reactions slowing down slightly, not disappearing, just arriving with less speed. There is a fraction of a second more space. And in that space, you feel something you may not have felt in a long time. The genuine possibility of choosing. Not choosing perfectly, just choosing consciously. This doesn't feel triumphant. It feels quiet, sometimes fragile. You respond a little differently. You pause instead of rushing. You stay silent where you usually explain, or you speak where you usually retreat. And nothing collapses. The discomfort passes, and something inside you feels more aligned, even if uncertain. There is often an internal judge that reacts to these moments. A voice that evaluates, that warns, that compares. This judge was installed as protection, as regulation. But when you begin to see it instead of obeying it, its grip loosens. It still appears. It just no longer commands. With this softening comes a sense of return, not to who you were, but to something that was never lost. The capacity to feel without immediately filtering, to be with experience without rushing to define it. This capacity was obscured, not destroyed. A question may arise quietly now. If so much was learned, absorbed, repeated, who are you beneath it? This question isn't meant to be answered. It's meant to remain open. Identity doesn't need to be fixed. It can be lived. You exist before definitions, before roles, before explanations. And the more you rest in direct experience, the less dependent you become on conditioned structures to tell you who you are. This doesn't mean withdrawing from life. You still engage, you still act, but something changes in how you do it. Less automatically, more attentively, and that subtle shift alters the texture of everyday moments. Over time, you may notice that certain choices no longer require force. When internal noise diminishes, when conditioning isn't fully in control, alignment becomes felt. Not dramatic, calm, clear. Anxiety about the future may soften, not because the future is known, but because trust grows. Trust in your ability to respond. Conditioning taught prediction and control. Presence teaches adaptation, and adaptation is more alive. Simplicity begins to emerge. Not minimalism, essential simplicity. You see what matters and what merely occupies space. Many concerns lose energy because they are no longer automatically fed. You may feel more compassion toward yourself, not indulgence. Understanding, seeing how you adapted with what you had. And this understanding naturally extends outward. You recognize conditioning in others, and judgment softens. This doesn't make you passive. It makes you clear. You choose where to engage, where to step back, where to set boundaries. Not from reaction, but from awareness. There is relief in realizing you don't need to arrive anywhere. You are not a project to complete. You are a process unfolding, and that removes a tremendous weight. Conditioning loses power when you allow impermanence, when you let yourself change, adjust, revise. This flexibility is not weakness. It is intelligence. At this point, the idea of conditioning is no longer abstract. You feel acting, and you feel when something else emerges. This sensitivity is the real shift. Not a revelation, but a way of seeing. Nothing ends here. Something opens. Conditioning remains, but it is no longer invisible. And that creates space. Space to pause. Space to feel. Space where choice, quiet and unannounced, can begin to form. That choice does not arrive as a clear command. It doesn't announce itself with confidence or certainty. It often comes as hesitation, as a moment where nothing happens right away. And because you've been trained to equate speed with competence, this hesitation can feel wrong, unproductive, even dangerous. Yet it is precisely here that something different can emerge. Conditioning thrives on immediacy, on quick reactions that bypass awareness. Presence, on the other hand, introduces delay, and delay changes the entire mechanism. When you no longer rush to complete the loop weakens. Not dramatically, gradually, almost politely. You begin to notice that many impulses were never orders. They were suggestions. Strong ones, perhaps. Urgent ones, but still suggestions. Fear suggests withdrawal. Desire suggests grasping. Habit suggests repetition. And for a long time, these suggestions were followed automatically, as if they carried authority. Now, you begin to see them for what they are: movements arising, not commands to obey. This realization doesn't remove discomfort. In fact, it can increase it at first, because the old system promised relief through automatic action. And now, by pausing, you are staying longer with sensation, with uncertainty, with not knowing. This is unfamiliar territory, but it is also honest territory. You may notice that some situations feel strangely empty now. Old patterns no longer satisfy, but new ones haven't formed yet. This in-between state can feel unsettling, as if something that once defined you is loosening and nothing has replaced it. Conditioning would rush to fill this gap, with labels, with goals, with explanations. Presence allows the gap to remain, and that gap is not a mistake. It is a transition. In this space, you begin to see how much effort went into maintaining a consistent version of yourself. How much energy was spent staying predictable, acceptable, coherent in the eyes of others and in your own internal narrative. When that effort relaxes, there can be fatigue. Not exhaustion, but release. As if a constant tension you didn't know you were holding finally softens. You may realize that many decisions you thought were personal were actually protective, designed to minimize certain feelings. Rejection, shame, conflict, loss. Conditioning taught you which paths reduced these risks, and you followed them faithfully. The cost was subtle. You avoided pain, but you also avoided depth. Now, as awareness grows, you start to tolerate a wider range of inner states. You can feel awkwardness without immediately correcting it. You can feel disagreement without rushing to smooth it over. You can feel longing without immediately dismissing it as unrealistic. This tolerance changes everything, because what you can feel without escaping no longer controls you. There is a quiet strengthening that happens here. Not the strength of force, but the strength of capacity. The capacity to stay present with experience as it unfolds. This presence does not make life easier in the conventional sense, but makes it more real, less mediated by automatic filters. You may begin to notice how often you used to abandon yourself in small ways. Laughing when something didn't feel funny, agreeing when something didn't feel right, staying silent when something wanted to be expressed. These were not moral failures. They were adaptations, and seeing them clearly is not a reason for guilt. It is an invitation for adjustment. Adjustment doesn't require grand gestures. It happens in micro movements. A slightly longer breath, a pause before answering, a willingness to say, "I don't know," instead of reaching for certainty. These are quiet acts, invisible to most, but internally they are profound. Over time, you may sense a different relationship with effort. Some things require less forcing. Others require more honesty. You begin to distinguish between resistance that protects you and resistance that limits you. This discernment cannot be taught. It emerges through lived attention. Conditioning once provided identity through repetition. Now, identity begins to feel more fluid, contextual, responsive. You're no longer just a fixed set of reactions. You're a field in which reactions appear. And this shift subtly alters how you experience yourself. You may notice that you listen differently, not just to others, but to yourself. Internal dialogue becomes less authoritative. Thoughts still arise, but they are not immediately believed. They are seen as events, not verdicts. This creates inner spaciousness. In that spaciousness, something quiet but resilient develops. A trust that you don't need to know in advance who you are in every moment. That you can meet situations as they come. That you can respond rather than perform. This is not a dramatic awakening. There is no final insight, no permanent state. There is simply a growing familiarity with the space before reaction. And that familiarity changes how life is lived. Conditioning doesn't vanish. It becomes transparent. You see when it operates. And sometimes you still follow it. not out of blindness, but out of choice. Because sometimes the familiar path is appropriate. The difference is that now, it is not the only path you can see. This awareness continues to deepen quietly, day by day, moment by moment, and without needing to announce itself. It reshapes the way decisions are felt, not just made. There is more space now, and in that space, life is no longer something that simply happens to you. It is something you begin, slowly, to participate in,